the subjects that I've already presented last year that I'm passionate about bringing together, it's mostly about connections between Buddhism as a philosophy and practice. I think it's very important to put that together, and the same as well for general semantics as a discipline and practice, a discipline that includes the practical application. Because otherwise, as Milton has already said in this quote from Korzybski, no results can be expected if we only talk about it. And how that relates to neurophenomenology, but I'll keep that part short. That's mostly kind of the frame which I use in order to present these topics at the conferences. So theory and practice, as well as, so the part of neurophenomenology would be about increasing awareness and accuracy of first, second, and third person evaluations and how that might be important in science. But I'll keep that part short because I'm seriously going to struggle with time during this talk. I already know that, so let's see. I hope I can succeed. Anyway, where do these disciplines meet, as well as all the things that we're talking about? Where are the connections? That's something I'm very passionate about. Now, I start with a short introduction of what I understand contemplative science to be. So I define it as a scientific investigation of contemplative traditions and practices. Most of this research in that area has been focusing, not entirely, but most of it is focusing on Buddhist practices, Buddhist meditation, but it might as well include Christian contemplative traditions. It could include Sufi mysticism, transcendental meditation, or many other meditative or contemplative practices. This really is a highly interdisciplinary field, as I just put a couple of examples of disciplines that play into this, which don't only include science, but also clinical applications, psychotherapy, mindful education or compassionate education, ethical leadership, caring economics. How does compassion, how could compassion influence economics, our understanding of it, our practice of it, etc., etc. So it really spans a wide range of fields. That's one thing that makes me so fascinated in this field. All right, and I'll start out with giving a brief introduction of neurophenomenology, just also because I've shown you that this is a connection that I make. So the person that you see on this picture is Francesco Varela, who was the founder of Neuro-phenomenology and passed away a bit more than 10 years ago. Here are some of the features of neurophenomenology which general semanticists might appreciate, I think, and surely there might have been influences on neurophenomenology from general semantics, also mostly indirectly, it seems. One of the core principles or core points is that the idea that first, second, and third person perspectives cannot be fully separated. And that, of course, has huge impact on how we even understand what scientific inquiry is, and it poses lots of challenges, especially the challenge if one wants to use first-person perspectives in scientific research. How can we make sure that these reports are accurate, that they can be trusted, that there is kind of a systematic sense of accuracy of how somebody reports, and that can be used in a scientific inquiry, but can inform the what's called the third-person approach of experimental cognitive science. And the question then arises, which kinds of training methods can be applied in order to increase the awareness of a subject of a study so that they will be better able to report their experience. And one of the suggestions that were formulated in neurophenomenology was Buddhist meditation, Buddhist philosophy and practice, and I would argue general semantics is a very interesting alternative candidate for that, or even they might even mutually inform each other. One technique that's quite interesting there, but I'll not say details about it, is the so-called elicitation interview technique developed by Claire Petit-Mauger. So if you're interested, talk to me afterwards or look it up. It's a very interesting approach, also as a kind of practice that one can benefit from. It also links concepts like the body and mind or organism and environment much in the way which I here represent with a tilde, even though Krzyzewski uses the hyphen, because people, not specifically from neurophenomenology, but anyway, there are researchers who have an idea similar to the idea that Krzyzewski had and use the tilde and have not heard about general semantics, but kind of use the same extensional device in a slightly different way, which I find very interesting. Anyway, let's go on to the next part. So that's Buddhism as a philosophy and practice. And some of you might identify with that picture. It's all fun and games till someone loses an eye. But anyway, so I hear a couple of chuckles, so some of you know what I mean. Anyway, if I would capture, so I have to point out also my preferred tradition in Buddhism is the Theravada tradition. So my angle is mostly coming from this early Buddhist tradition and early Buddhist philosophy. Here you see a Theravada monk, actually the abbot of a monastery in southern California. And summarizing Buddhism in a nutshell would be a Pali word. Pali was an ancient language spoken in the Buddha's time. Ehipassiko, which means can be translated as come and see for yourself. It's kind of a scientific curiosity, try out for yourself rather than just trust. You need to practice, you need to see the results yourself, and only then accept the teaching or whatever some seems meaningful to you to practice. Only then accept it as a useful practice, which is very much what Milton said before about general semantics as a practice. And one interesting quote that the historical Buddha Gautama Siddhartha spoke roughly 500 years before our time, before Christ, is I teach only dukkha and the cessation of dukkha. So I teach only dukkha means suffering, stress, unsatisfactoriness, or can be translated in that way. And so one quote that he used was, I'm really only talking about this. What is suffering for beings like humans? How does it arise? How can it be brought to its cessation? What's the path leading to that? And I use this quote because I want to put it kind of not side by side, but there will be another quote by Krzyzewski. Actually, the quote it's another quote, not the quote that Milton used, but we'll see that shortly. Couple of principles of Buddhism. Now, I'm tempted to go into lots of detail here, but let's just keep it short. 3 main characteristics in Buddhist philosophy that the Buddha often spoke about are impermanence. Phenomena that arise also pass away. Nothing's really permanent. Then the concept of dukkha, stress, suffering, unsatisfactoriness, which is also due to impermanence. Things that we like are not going to stay the way they are. And we will also experience things that are unpleasant. And then there's also the issues of aging, illness, and death, which no one of us, no living being, can really avoid ultimately. And then there's a very interesting other concept called anatta, not self, is what it's usually translated as, and relates very strongly to the notion, also general semantics notion of non-identity, although from a slightly different angle. There's a learnable skill in Buddhism, or many learnable skills, and one core skill would be the cultivation of mindfulness, and that can be achieved through various kinds of meditation practice or contemplative practice. The goal is another one as the one that's formulated by general semantics, but anyway. In principle, it's about reducing human suffering, and that's also where there's a strong parallel to what motivated Krzyzewski to really explore and develop general semantics due to his experiences in the First World War. All right, so we'll skip that. There are lots of applications for Buddhist practice and Buddhist meditation, and there's a lot of research being done on that. Here I show you a couple of names. There's a lot of research, especially in terms of contemplative sciences, connected to the Mind and Life Institute that has been founded by the Dalai Lama and Francisco Varela, whom I showed you before. And here are lots of names of researchers. But in the interest of time, let's go to general semantics. Now, certainly it would be the wrong place to talk about what general semantics means because, well, anyway, but what I want to just show you is how I introduce general semantics to an audience which may not have heard about general semantics, as is usually the case. And I start usually with the non-pipe, which you might be familiar with, and use that as an example for the map-territory relationship as a starting point, which of course informs the way in which I would then lay out further points as a very, I would say, young practitioner in general semantics terms for sure. But talking about that is of course also a very good practice in order to understand myself better, the principles and applications of general semantics. All right, this is how I would describe general semantics, not by definition of general semantics is, but it can be described as, and then giving a couple of examples, many of which you're certainly familiar with. Interesting, the ones that describe it as in terms of interactions of organisms with their environments, or kinds of embodied practices that increase our understanding, our awareness, or our consciousness, as some people would describe it here. So here's the quote that Milton already showed. That's of course not only true to general semantics, it's also something that can be said about, for instance, contemplative practices, as well as yoga, sports, climbing, whatever you want to do, cooking. If you don't apply the principles, no results can be expected. Anyway, this I can skip over. This is a quote that I already kind of indirectly introduced before, that Krzyzewski said, "I want to make clear only that words are not things spoken about, and that there is no such thing as an object in absolute isolation." Certainly, this is not the only interesting Krzyzewski quote that is worthy of flashing on slides in a presentation to introduce people to it. But in the contexts that I've been in these conferences, that I think was a very helpful quote that bears deeper reflection occasionally. And then there is this part of introducing the structural differential and pointing out that there is this instruction of being silent on the objective level, and that also has very strong parallels to contemplative practices, where inward silence, in order to be able to really observe in detail without getting distracted by the contents of your thoughts, is a core part of the practice, and the same as a core part of general semantics practice. All right, here I summarize a couple of parallels that I find very relevant. Both systems strive to reduce suffering, even though they come from completely different angles and cultures, general semantics being very scientifically oriented, and Buddhism being embedded in various religious, spiritual, and also cultural contexts at a time long before our modern age in which we live now. But both take a very pragmatic scientific orientation, both emphasize theory and practice. They emphasize one very fundamental principles, which I find very fundamental because they're even could be called subversive, because they run so counter to our everyday understanding of how we conduct our lives and how we interpret our experience, highlighting the nature of impermanence, the nature of, or the principle of non-identity. And my hypothesis is that they can lead to certain similar results of practice, but certainly not the same, and there will be surely many differences. And what I would find very interesting is how to explore that further in terms of scientific studies in a similar way as they've been done and are being done in contemplative science. What would general semantics practice be like if we investigate it scientifically? And that can have mutual benefits, as you can surely imagine. Right, both provide also not only entry points, but rather, I would say, contact interfaces, bidirectional, to a different kind of orientation in life, in applications like clinical or therapeutic applications, and in theoretical as well as empirical research, which I think should also be hyphenated, because theory and empirical research, to separate them would not really do, well, that would kind of introduce an elementalistic fallacy. Now, this is how it plays out in practice. Just checking across the time. Okay, all right. So this is, well, I hope it's not interpreted as narcissism that I put myself on this picture. This is a picture I sent to my wonderful girlfriend who lives back in Graz in Austria. As you can tell by this symbol that I put here in front of a poster that I used at the presentation. I have handouts with this poster here as well. And what I use is this white space as a whiteboard. The poster is laminated. People write on it. I also write on it. There's interesting stuff written on it. Some people read the poster, discuss in front of it. Sometimes I participate in the discussion or not. It's very interactive. And then there's something like this green, here, you can't really see it here, but somebody wrote, this is not a text, and somebody else wrote, this is a poster, not a text, and then somebody else probably said, well, actually, and so it goes and goes and goes on. So this is a very interesting, also kind of practical application of trying to introduce that to people. And what I also found is when I speak about general semantics, people usually say, aha, yeah, I know Buddhism, I know excuse me, it's always difficult to pronounce neuro-phenomenology or phenomenology itself. I don't know general semantics, what is this? And then I try to start to explain, and what I found is it's not very helpful if I just go on explaining and give them in 10 minutes a number of principles that boggle one's mind if one is not familiar with them. But as soon as I start asking them, well, what are you interested in, or maybe after one or two introductory sentences, then I find the entry points to further conversation, and then it becomes much more enriched and the interest is sustained. So that's something that I found in my practice of speaking about that when I do a poster presentation, which actually has, in this respect, many advantages over an oral presentation. So my personal experience from attending all these various conferences, some of which I've mentioned here, towards the Science of Consciousness conference last year and this year. One ASSC is very sciencey, that's the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. Then there are various events from the Mind and Life, or connected to the Mind and Life Institute, etc. What I found is several presenters emphasize in some point in their talk, especially when they show some model, they say, but remember, the map is not the territory. However, usually I get very excited and think, oh, this person knows general semantics, I'm going to talk with them. So I go there, and then it turns out that very few of these individuals actually know about general semantics. Usually they know about it. They know the names Korzybski or Hayakawa, but they're usually not thoroughly familiar with them, with a couple of exceptions. My experience, it's usually the older generation, so people who have lived during their 50s, 60s, 70s already, like Basil Hiley. I'll show a slide from one of his talks afterwards, or people like Russell Hurlbut, who is a neurophenomenologist. But also there are a few young individuals. I had a very pleasant, unexpected, although it was almost like not mind-blowing experience, but I was very surprised to talk to a young philosophy student from the University of Birmingham, and finding out that we share not exactly the same interests, but the interests in phenomenology, in neurophenomenology, in Buddhism, in general semantics, and then we really managed to talk in very much detail about that. So I would certainly hope that more of that will happen. So right. So this is just an example of one slide where I found a more explicit mention of Korzybski, which was actually a physics lecture about Bohm's interpretation of quantum mechanics and some recent results, in which Basil Hiley, an eminent physicist, in a keynote lecture then had this Korzybski quote, whatever we say it is, it isn't. So then, of course, then I also asked the question about this in the Q&A and spoke with him afterwards. But that was really an exception. Now, super briefly, what I find as interesting possible entry points, now these are really just my point of view, what I personally would be interested in is tapping into a trend in contemplative research, which could be described as developing models of mindfulness. David Vago is one person which I also recently met, who is developing, doing research on that. He's a neuroscientist, a contemplative neuroscientist. As well as a fascinating model. I totally will not have the time, nor actually perhaps the really required expertise to go into much detail. But anyway, this is also a very interesting paper. So talk to me afterwards if you'd like to know these papers about very interesting trends in these fields of research. All right, so lots of commonalities. Let's just go over that very quickly. What is the outlook? General semantics principles, as I have found in my kind of personal investigation in this field, have already informed various disciplines, often indirectly or unintentionally, meaning people are not actually aware that they are applying these principles. But I'm absolutely convinced that these connections can be really harnessed and nurtured more consciously, which I would describe in the spirit of Milton, conscious times binding to inform the time binding processes in science, which are already there for mutual benefit. So the question then is, how can we best establish these dialogues between the general semantics community and these science communities? And one suggestion that I would have, what might happen in a couple of years perhaps, is there are often pre-conference or post-conference workshops, particularly pre-conference workshops, which would be very interesting here. If general semantics pre-conference workshops at academic conferences would be conducted, that could really, really have an interesting and, in my opinion, highly beneficial impact on the scientific discourse that then develops there, at least for the people who've participated in the workshop, but surely that would then, extend further. All right, I think I'll go pretty much over that. This is mostly to speculate about how this can really also inform and perhaps in a way transform science as we currently think about it, as well as human life in general, which we know general semantics has some capability of doing that. But I think I've already bombarded you with my enthusiasm and with far too many details. I thank you very, very much for your presence, and I look forward to questions, ideas, exchange that I can participate in, but also to witness people talk with each other. It's just a wonderful experience, and it's a wonderful experience, particularly at this conference. I thank you very, very much, and I'm thanks.